Is it possible for writers starting out today to have the same type of TV writing career that you had?
In terms of writers nowadays having the same kind of career I had, no, they can't really, because television's changed so much. Well, when I started out, I started writing in the late 70s and still am going strong today. I've been very lucky. Back then, most shows had freelance slots. So in other words, for instance, when I was a producer on Sliders, we had a 22 episode order for that season, and 11 of those would be freelance slots. So every day we were taking pitches from writers, and we knew we'd have to buy 11 scripts. Now we might rewrite those extensively because we knew the show day in and day out in a way that the freelancers wouldn't necessarily. But that might be that person's first sale. It might get them into the industry. It gave so many people chances to get their foot in the door, get a start. And I actually ended up writing for so many different shows because sometimes I'd be on staff, but other times I'd just be a freelancer coming in and pitching. And so it allowed me also to write for a number of different shows, much more so than if I was on staff, because, you know, usually you're exclusive to that show, or you might be able to write a feature when you're on hiatus. But on any given year, any given day, I would be multitasking. I got very, very good at multitasking. So I might be, well, like for instance, when I was a producer on Sliders, I was writing my own scripts, helping with every phase of the writing on everyone else's scripts. And, but I sold to Deep Space Nine that year, and Far Beyond the Stars. I had sold a trilogy to HarperCollins, so I was starting to write the first novel with Barbara Hambly and outlining the second one with Maya Bonhoff. And I'd also been hired to write all the outlines for Animorphs and lay out that show and write several scripts for that show. So, for instance, so I would get into my office at Universal at 6 in the morning, write an entire outline for Animorphs, and then by 10, I'd be done with that. I'd have faxed it to New York, and then the Sliders guys would come in and I'd do my Sliders job all day, and then on the weekend I might be working on the novel, so or on the outline for the Deep Space Nine episodes. So it was a great way to work, because you know how to go from one thing to another without losing quality. That's the hugely important thing. You don't ever want to be just providing fodder. You don't want to just be writing. My friend Frank Spotnitz, who created Man in the High Castle and ran the X-Files, he says, good enough is never good enough. And I agree with that 100%. He also says every time you should aim for the bleachers, because you might at least get a single, you know? And I share that view, which is give it your best. I mean, you should just, everything you've got should go into everything you do. And if it's not good enough, work harder, you know? And sometimes you're not gonna write the great American novel or the great American screenplay. You know, one of my friends who's in Ohio and calls me quite often, and he said, well, you know, that episode of whatever show it was, Forever Night or whatever, that show that was on last week wasn't up to your normal standard. Why was that? And I said, well, you know how like when you're in school and sometimes you really try your best, but you get a B on a test or a C+ or whatever. It's sort of like that, you know. It just didn't come together, but it wasn't for lack of trying, you know. And so, but that's part of it. And but in terms of possibilities for the writers now, they're much greater. For instance, when I started, there were 3 networks and PBS, and so they were 24/7 stations. They weren't. You couldn't watch a show when you wanted to. There was no home video. And so there were only a certain number of shows they could make just because of the hours in a day. So it limited how many writers could get work, and it limited what kind of work you could get, because if the show wasn't approved by the network, there was nothing you could do. And if you wanted to write something and shoot it on your own, it would cost millions of dollars minimally, and that was very, very difficult to raise that money. Now, there's over 500 scripted comedy and drama series on the air on all the networks and VOD platforms. And so there's an enormous amount more slots for writers. Additionally, even though there isn't freelance per se, there still is freelance in animation, but not in live action by and large. But also people can make their own web series, they can make their own podcasts. There's so many ways to get a following, to get an audience. And I say to everyone, I wouldn't go back to any other period in my life. I'm happiest of all now, because I have such great autonomy. My audience has given me over $2.5 million to open my own studio and make Space Command, and And now I'm raising even more money. It turned out I had a knack. And so I don't have to ask permission from anyone. I just come up with an idea, I write it, I cast it, I shoot it, I put it out to my audience around the world. And that doesn't mean that the studios and networks and VOD platforms can't be my partners. They can, but they aren't the deciding factor of what I do in terms of what I make, in terms of creatively. And that's a pure joy.
So going back to the 70s and being a freelancer, completely different as to the tone of your day, what you're working on.
It wasn't so much different as to what I'm working on, because I was always working on shows that I had a passion for. So whether it was Sliders or even Friday the 13th, the series, which I story edited, I would always find the core of it, the emotional core that would resonate with me. It always had to be something that I could cue into, otherwise I wouldn't write it. And I always worked with people who I liked and who liked me. And I was very lucky in that way. And the studio executives and network executives we dealt with, fortunately, were very supportive and very smart. And so I didn't find them intrusive. There are the other kind of executives, and you want to try and avoid those. In Greenlighting Yourself, I have a section on working with stupid people. And my first piece of advice is, if you can avoid it, avoid it. But if you have to work with someone who's in the food chain, they might be above you in the food chain, here's how you can do it and not have the work be ruined and not be fired. And so I go into some experiences from my career where I'm able to walk people through that. And but again, it wasn't so much content that was different. It was simply, it's almost like there's a difference between performing a play, if you're an actor, to an audience versus auditioning. Because auditioning, you need someone to approve you in order to do your work creatively. Whereas when you're in a play performing for the audience, that's the direct relationship. So the more that I can be in the direct relationship creatively, the conversations between me and the world, me and my audience, the better. And really what started me on this journey of opening my own studio and doing crowdfunding and selling investment shares in Space Command and so forth was simply that so many of my friends who were the greatest writers in television had written projects that were great and should have become hit series, and the network or the studio cut them off at script or cut them off at pilot. The audience never saw those great shows. And I thought, you know, in books, once a novelist is relatively successful, then he can create a body of work, like Stephen King, for instance, or name any writer that you love. And so they have an authorial voice and a shape to their career that follows their enthusiasms and what they want to talk about at any given time. But that's not true with television writers. With television writers, for the most part, they're constantly stymied from doing the projects they're most enthusiastic about, or the projects that might even be their best work, because the studio and the networks have different objectives, which are primarily financial objectives. And again, they have a right to do that if they're writing the checks. But now that we can go directly to our audience and raise money that way, the fact that we can now shoot for so much less, because digital is so much less expensive, we can change the rules into our favor. And you know, it used to be when young people would, like young directors or writers would say, well, they're not letting me have my dream. And I would say, well, who's not letting you have your dream? And they say, well, the networks or the studios or whatever. And back when it cost millions of dollars to make a movie, you'd say, okay, well, then that makes sense. They are being stymied. But now, since, you know, they have a camera in their pocket, I don't accept that excuse anymore. If someone says they're not letting me have my dream, I'll say, you're using an excuse to avoid doing the work. Because the work is get a camera, get some people together, get the best actors you can find, make it happen. One way or another, make it happen. And a great minute is better than a mediocre 2 hours of material. But if people love it, you'll start to build your audience. That starts to build a career.
How did fear of success almost ruin your screenwriting career? And when you hear that from these other writers,
yes,
do you hear fear of success in their voice, or it's asking for permission?
I think there's always a counterweight between fear of success and fear of failure in everyone's heart in one way or another in different measures. One is always afraid of exposure. One is always afraid of screwing it up, you know, and ultimately you have to be willing to face that and get past it and get over it and get around it. Your job is to get your work done. your creative work. And with all of my mentors, whether it's Rod Serling or Ray Bradbury or Guillermo del Toro, with whom I wrote a book not long ago, I seek out mentors who are brilliant at what they do. And then one of my key questions always is, when you encounter failure or when you encounter rejection, what do you do? And because what I'm looking for are strategies that I can apply to my own life and my own career that keep me moving forward. And it's been incredibly invaluable, because you find that the higher up someone goes as a writer or a director or whatever, or an actor, their fear is still there, but they have coping mechanisms where the period that they're in breakdown is shorter and shorter and shorter. So in other words, for instance, when Guillermo del Toro was preparing to film his dream project, The Mountains of Madness, based on an H.P. Lovecraft novel, they pulled the plug on it. Universal did, because they thought it would be too expensive and R-rated and so forth. And Guillermo had other irons in the fire, and he immediately jumped over to Pacific Rim, and he was off and running. So that didn't mean he didn't feel terrible and maybe had a weekend of feeling very sorry for himself, but he got into motion, and he was already preparing for that eventuality in advance so that he wouldn't be stopped. And it's very important. You know, I think, don't be afraid of success, because success is very nice. You know, when you write a book that's successful, or a TV show that people talk about for decades, or you get a big payday, those things are fine. They're fine. I think people are often afraid of scrutiny. They're often afraid of, well, I'm a fraud and I won't be able to handle success. But success is an extremely amorphous thing. First of all, you can define what success means to you. For instance, at this point in my life, I don't need to have the $1 million payday. You know, I need to keep working creatively and getting my work out to an audience, but money is not at all what rules me. I've made choices. We still live in an apartment. We own our 2 cars outright. You know, it's, I've made choices that allow my life to be very free in that way. But for me, success is very, very clear. And I'm glad that I've been successful, you know, I mean, you know, I can look at my career and say, well, clearly I've succeeded, because I've created work that people are still talking about, you know, 40 years after I did it. And also I've earned significant money writing for the studios and the networks. Until Space Command, I'd only written for the studios and the networks and the major publishers. I'd never done any independent film projects. And then, you know, because of this roundtable I mentor, I started hearing about crowdfunding, and I thought, well, let's see if I can raise money. And it turned out I could. So.
Even though Rod Serling was considered a dashingly handsome, confident man,
Yes.
angry at times maybe, do you think he had a touch of fear of success? Did he mask it with sort of this pretty boy, you know, facade?
I don't think he was afraid of success. He was extremely charismatic, extremely confident, without being arrogant, but he felt that he had failed in his career, which is terribly sad. The last interview he gave before he died at age 50 in 1975, the interviewer said, do you think you've been successful? Do you think you've written work that will stand the test of time? And he said, the good writing, like fine wine, has to age well with time. He said, I think my work has been momentarily adequate, which is astonishing. And it's so sad that he didn't live till now, because he would have seen that he had created one of the greatest masterpieces of television, and he had inspired an entire generation of showrunners. I mean, every major showrunner in drama, Rod is their hero. He's the idol. He's the guy who sort of led the way. And it's really sad that he didn't get to know that. You know, so I'm sure he would have been amazed and extremely gratified.
Sure, many other, Philip K. Dick, same thing.
Philip K. Dick was a different case, because he was, Philip K. Dick at least got to see the footage from Blade Runner. He knew that somebody was getting what he was doing. And so my God, he created a huge amount of work. I mean, I think he wrote 12 novels in a year, plus short stories. I mean, it's like, let's hear it for amphetamines, you know, so.
Yes, I think that did help fuel him. But also,
Yes.
he had his own, what did he call the hovel, which was his sort of grungy little.
Yeah, he was a troubled man. It was very funny. He was a troubled man, and there was all this whole thing of how drugs drove him crazy, and at the end he was raving and insane and all that stuff. And I had dinner not long ago with Greg Benford, who's a fairly conservative professor and also a science fiction writer. And we got on the subject of Philip K. Dick, and he said, oh, no, Phil wasn't like that at all. He was very sweet, very funny. His mind was perfectly together, and he knew him at, throughout the latter years of his life. And so I was very glad to hear that, because I think sometimes the media can get an impression of someone which isn't accurate. And Philip K. Dick was an amazing writer, and I'm glad that he had friends who really saw who he was and valued that.